Hello and welcome to CREDL 2 Morality Part 1. Um, this is an introduction to the Catholic vision of morality, and we'll start with the contents. Um, we're gonna look at some common and somewhat misleading impressions of what morality consists in. And then we're going to introduce the Catholic vision of morality as related to life in Christ, which is the section of the Catechism which deals with morality. We look at what is moral conscience. Again, we'll broach the reality of sin. We'll look at concepts like vice and virtue. And finally, we'll look at the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and what their importance and their binding nature for all humankind. So, what's morality? Well, here's some kind of misleading common images. Pay, pray, and obey. Isn't that what you're supposed to do? It's just obedience. Well, the church is a sure teacher on morals, but a person is responsible before God for their own moral choices. It's about not getting caught, and that's a very diminished view of morality. In fact, someone, I think it was a commentator, political commentator, says morality is about doing the right thing even when no one's watching, and I think there's some truth in that. What feels right? We can't go wrong if we follow our heart. Feelings can't be wrong, can they? But are our feelings a sure guide to what is right? Always, even often? What do you think? I say the feelings can be as misleading and dangerous as well as supportive of moral action. And being nice, a nice person is a moral person is a nice person, right? There's some sense in that, but it's pretty shallow and it's possible to be nice on a surface, but quite unpleasant underneath. Um, Morality's like my rules. Humpty Dumpty said, words mean whatever he wants to mean. And maybe we could do the same with moral rules, but that is not the Catholic vision of morality. We find ourselves under a law that we did not put there, as Gaudium et Spes says. Some people who are anarchists say no rules. But these are the people who start screaming and crying if you poke them in the eye. I'm not saying advocating violence, but that they want rules that work for them, but they want the freedom not to have rules in their own conduct. And of course, that's a recipe for anarchy. And the kind of destruction of the common good. So, what is morality then? Well, morality in the Catholic vision is related to a higher question, which is what is the purpose of life? What does it mean to live a life which is fulfilled, a life that we would think worthwhile? What is life to the full? So, in the Catholic vision, life to the full is eternal bliss with God in eternity. That's the fullness of life. But even now, we are partakers of that fullness. We are vouchsafed in that journey towards our destiny. We can certainly frustrate that, but if we allow God to make us holy, God will make us holy. So I asked some little primary children what heaven was like, and these are their answers without any kind of editing. Heaven is where God is. It's very theological. Um, Heaven is beautiful, full of flowers, where there's nothing untrue and horrid, where everyone you ever knew is still there waiting for you to visit them. With that idea of community, of happiness. A cloudy place. The floor is clouds and it has a lovely garden. Poetic soul there. It's like a big world for people that have died. It's where Mrs. Kennedy is. She was a beloved teacher of the primary pupils, and unfortunately, she died, and they still mourned her. Heaven is like a singing bird high in a tree, another poetic soul. Heaven is like the most beautifulest place in the world. Heaven has the music of a million angels. Heaven is like an ocean. Heaven is like a home. That's very theological. Heaven is not like school. Heaven is a free country. So, but you can see in these little pupils their instincts for what heaven is. And quite a lot of what they're answering is pretty theological, out of the mouths of babes. So Jesus, John 10:10, that famous passage, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. So Jesus shows us the true face of God, but he shows us what it is to be truly human, truly alive. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. So the question of morality, of oughts and ought nots, is situated in this bigger question: what is life for? Anything that it moves us, progresses us towards our destiny, our fulfillment, is good. Anything that frustrates is bad. And Moses kind of in the Hebrew scriptures, when he's talking to the people of Israel, he's just giving them the commandments of God. And he says, I am offering you life or death. Choose life then, so that you and your descendants may live. So that connection of morality in that bigger question of fullness of life, that's the distinct Catholic Christian view. So every human being is destined for the eternal blissful union with God. One way of a theological way of thinking about that is beatitude. The question of the moral life only makes full sense against the backdrop of this vision of life to the full. As both God and man, Jesus shows us in himself the true face of God and what it is to be fully human and fully alive. Every human being is made in God's image. This means that we are free to walk towards or frustrate our true destiny, to choose life or death, in the words of Moses to the people of Israel. What is moral conscience? Well, have a think about that. What is moral conscience? I often ask the face-to-face students that I teach, and it's one of those things that people they know, but they can't really explain what it is. So they come up with different sorts of conceptions, and some of them are misleading. The classic is the angel and the devil whispering in one ear, "No, don't do that. Don't do that bad thing." And the devil is, "Oh, you go and do it. You'd love it." So that's kind of a false picture. But what it does get across psychologically is we often feel divided. There's a war. We have something as a consequence of original sin. Even though original sin is cleansed in baptism, there's something within us called concupiscence. That is a kind of a magnetism, you might say, towards what is not good. And each of us experiences that in different ways. St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, said, I find a law in my body at war with the law of my mind. And, that's a legacy of concupiscence. And that's, we're called to rely on grace, to walk um, with God, and to kind of do battle against our own tendencies. So, what another view, a voice. And I think this is a very common view of conscience. And it has something in it which connects with Catholic teaching, but it needs some adjustment. Um, you sometimes falsely see people saying in Catholic teaching, conscience is the voice of God. Not quite right. Conscience, as Gaudium et Spes says, deep within us, we discover a law that we didn't put there. There we hear the voice of God who echoes in our depths. So it's more of it's a kind of receptivity to the voice of God deep within our depths. Some, like Freud, say, it's conscience is just a residue from being told off as a child. You internalize this and it stays with you. Very simplistic and certainly not in conformity with Catholic understandings. Some think that you can DIY your own conscience. You can kind of reprogram or reboot your sense of right and wrong. And again, that is a fundamental no-no for Catholic orthodoxy. Some people think it's culture internalized. Now, certainly, culture does, I think, have an influence on how you think what is proper and worthwhile. We think of things like social mores as under that kind of heading, but it's far too simplistic an explanation for a universal human sense of right and wrong. Some people think that conscience is for losers. It's people who scruple lose. But that kind of, you might even say, Nietzschean attitude is one which, when rulers and regimes follow through on this, very bad things happen. So, conscience, what is it? Well, Notice that I is right front and center in the middle of conscience. Conscience is my mind making moral judgments, as St. Thomas Aquinas has it. It's not this kind of bolt-on thing. It is central to my identity. It's one with my own rational being. Um, now, but the more we disobey or ignore the voice of the promptings of conscience, the less the conscience can, less influence it has over us, and we suffer that kind of internal kind of, you know, basically we lose our capacity to act morally if we're not careful. Conscience, though, must be formed. Conscience must, as part of our minds, just like anything else, we grow in kind of the intellectual part of our mind. The conscientious part of our mind, it must be informed by the Word of God, by church teaching, by prayer, by good advice, by saintly models, um, and it's a lifelong endeavor. Conscience must always be followed. To follow conscience is to lead to life. I mean, even the Gaudium et Spes says for people who've never heard the gospel, who've never had a chance to encounter the gospel of Christ, the following through of conscience, Christ can save them through that. So it's essential for all people, believers, those who've not heard the gospel, to follow conscience. But sometimes that's tricky. So the conscientious way is a road not taken easily. It's easy to follow the broad route. And Jesus, in one of his sayings, talked about the way to destruction, how broad and easy it is. But the way to life is a narrow way and a hard way, and few take it. But to give you an example in my own personal experience, I've just had my floors done. They're pine floors, and I was having them sort of sanded. And to finish off the job, I had employed a guy to come with a special machine. But there was a problem with the quote. I thought he was going to do this for the entire floors that I have. And he said, no, it's only for this room. My boss says it's only for this room. So I thought, hang on a minute, I'm paying you £600, £700 just for one room. And so he said, well, if you don't tell my boss, I'll just do it for six, 700, but don't tell him that. Yeah, it would have been so easy and so convenient and so, but yet I just thought, I can't do this. It's a dishonest thing and nobody would ever know. And we all have that kind of experience of trying to follow through and doing the right thing because it's the right thing. So, okay, so moving on, here's a little, it's a charming story, really. It's about an angsty teenager who shoplifted a book. And she moved from to Mexico, but she kind of felt really, really guilty, and so she came back, uh, paid up for it, and tried to make up for it. And she ends up saying, "I'm truly sorry about my stupidity, as well as the horrendous amount of run-on sentences in this letter." Um, but we all have experienced the guilt of not following through on conscience. Sometimes it's sudden, sometimes it kind of grows, but it's that part of that's too is an important aspect of conscience. So here's a question. Pause at this video now. You should always follow the certain judgment of conscience. That's Catholic teaching. Notice certain judgment of conscience. But why? You might say, well, conscience needs to be formed, and it might not be formed in the right way, or it might have something, it might need to be developed. So why should one always follow the certain judgment of conscience? That is strict Catholic teaching. Because at the moment of decision, that's your light. That's the light you go by. So you must always follow the certain judgment of conscience. There used to be a Scottish law lord called Lord Mackay of Clashfern, and he was the Chief Justice in the land, in the realm, in the kingdom, the UK. And he was a member of a small Protestant church called the Wee Frees, a very strict Presbyterian church, who think, for example, that the Catholic Mass is a blasphemous fable. So they're very much against They wouldn't darken the doors of it. They wouldn't, it's a blasphemous fable. So Lord Mackay's one of his senior colleagues, a Catholic judge, died, and there was a requiem mass, and he was invited to this requiem mass. So he's at a point where he's saying, "Well, what am I going to do?" He attended the mass, and that's certainly in his own inner light. That's what he thought that was the thing to do. But he was excommunicated from his community. I think they kind of resolved things over the years. But that's the sort of thing that, we all had times in our lives where there's a we know the right thing to do, and it's going to cause a fuss, but we know it's the right thing to do. Yes, the Catholic Church, if it's certain, if your conscience is certain, then you must always follow the certain judgments of conscience. That does not apply when there's some uncertainty. Then that requires discernment. Franz Jägerstätter, who is a perfect example of what the cost of conscience is. So he was an Austrian man, devout Catholic, and father of three little girls, and he refused on grounds of conscience to serve in Hitler's army. Many tried to change his mind, even priests and bishops, just become a medical orderly or something like that. He was imprisoned and executed and declared a martyr by the church. And here's what he wrote in prison. He said, "Neither prison nor chains nor sentence of death can rob a man of the faith and his free will. God gives so much strength that it is possible to bear any suffering. People worry about the obligations of conscience as they concern my wife and children, but I cannot believe that just because one has a wife and children, a man is free to offend God." That's Franz Jägerstätter, executed and a martyr of the church. So, in summary, deep within conscience, a person discovers a law inscribed by God. It calls one to do what is good and to avoid evil, sounding in the heart at the right moment. And the heart in Jewish Hebrew understanding was the seat of judgment. So, conscience is a judgment of reason where you recognize the moral quality of some here and now act before, during, after. The proper formation of conscience is a vital and lifelong task. The certain judgments of conscience must be followed. All right, so that's a kind of a summary of conscience. What of sin? Um, it's a three-letter word and it's a hard word, but it's a real word. We all experience in ourselves and in the world around us the reality and the effects of wrongdoing. So if you had to define sin or wrongdoing, how would you define it? And again, it's a bit like conscience. Have a think, maybe pause. What would count? Let's say you're in a teaching context, for example, and a child asks you, what is sin? What is it to sin? Um, what's the difference between sin and an honest mistake? And that's a it's something to ponder on. Well, it's not an outdated concept, whether we call it sin, wrongdoing, messing up, doing bad stuff, falling below the usual high standards I expect of myself, whatever. We know full well the sad reality of our misdeeds. It's not hang-ups either. It's not a hang-up. It's a willed, deliberate action or omission. And as we say in the confess, through in what I've done and in what I have failed to do. For some people, it's something what other people do. I pay my taxes, separate the recycling, support dolphin charities. There is a beautiful parable. All Jews' parable have beauty and truth because Christ himself is truth in person. And it's the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee. So Pharisees, as you'll know from your earlier studies, were seen as model Jews, following devout followers of the law. And so they go up to the temple in Jerusalem, and the Pharisee congratulates himself before God. He says, I thank you, that I'm not like other men who just adulterous. I'm not like this tax collector. I pay, tithes on all I get. I fast twice a week, etc., etc. Right at the back, a tax collector, which you'll know was a kind of seen as a traitor to his own people because he collected collected money from Jewish people, and gave it to Rome, and he took his extra cut, so he ripped them off as well. So they were seen as numbered as sinners and outcasts. So the tax collector goes up and he just beats his breast, which is a symbol of repentance, and he said, "God be merciful to me, a sinner." And Jesus then tells his audience, he said, That man, the tax collector, went home at rights with God, not the other. So it's an important kind of element, the need for humility, to recognize, our need for change and our need for God's grace. Um, is sin a crime? No, sin is a bigger thing than crime, which is breaking the law of the land. Not every sin is a crime, e.g., adultery is a sin, but not a crime in the UK. Is every crime a sin? Have a think about that. Pause the video. Is every crime a sin? And the answer is no, not necessarily, because we called a law in a particular land positive law. In other words, a law that's put out there by a particular country. But the higher law that governs positive law, to make that positive law moral, is called the natural law. And if the positive law is not in conformity with natural law, then positive law is evil in that respect, and we're not obliged to follow it. So, for example, I'm thinking of the racial segregation in the 50s, 60s of the US, and the kind of laws that applied. That there were unjust laws, and when Rosa Parks and other people stood up to that, and as it were broke the law, they were doing a good thing because they were resisting an evil law. Sin is not my fault. My genes are bringing bad company, weather, diet, low self-esteem, etc. Circle appropriate. No, by definition, sin is something we can help. I mean, yes, we're all affected by our own kind of um, the mosaic of lots of things, but in the end, we are made in the very image of God, and part of that is to experience free will. It doesn't mean it's an unlimited free will. I'm not free to dine at the Ritz or go to the moon, but it means in our moral life is truly ours, and we are the owners of our moral deeds. Now, here's something I think we all need to take on board. Some people think that sins are things that shock us, like they attract headlines for the notoriety, cheating, lying, backstabbing, and so on. But really, we should be more shocked by the fact we're not shocked by certain sins. Um, say, gossip, for example, people, oh, it's just a bit of gossip. That's a really destructive force in society. Pope Francis said that, it's a form of murder. It's a form of, yeah, and once people spill out something and color a person's reputation in a way, it does a great deal of damage. And Matthew 12:36 says, you will have to answer for every unaccounted word. Um, Another thing is of using words wrongly is the misuse of God's name. And again, that is so common. Oh my God. I'm saying that not to misuse the name, but I'm just saying that is too, that's something that when in my teaching career, I absolutely worked assiduously to remove from the pupils' sort of ways of speaking. Um, Again, it's directly against the second commandment. Do not misuse that name, the names of that which is holy. Okay, then. So, what is sin? Well, you might say it's disobeying the law of God, disobeying the law of conscience, failing to love. Um, there's a lot of ways we could, but we all can kind of center around what sin is. Now, in tradition, there are seven deadly sins. Just pause the video. Do you know them? Can you name them to yourself? The seven deadly sins. And that backdrop is a kind of a church sort of wall painting, which is trying to represent the seven deadly sins. And there's that afflict us. And I think they afflict us in different ways. I think we all have different kinds of things that we need to work on. And what's an issue for one might not be an issue for another. Okay, the seven deadly sins. If you've got them, pride is certainly that's really the one that's the one that's behind pretty much behind every sin really. Um, there's two kinds of things that we might think of a greed. One, gluttony, so the bodily appetites, but a greed that is what sometimes called avarice, which is a greed for more possessions and a worldliness. So there's sloth, and that might not be just kind of being a couch potato, but failing to develop our capacities, the gifts that God has given us. Um, so that's four. Envy is certainly, and it's very directly against the 10th commandment. What are the final two? Well, lust and wrath. Now, wrath we need to get right. Wrath is not merely anger. There's such a thing as righteous anger or righteous indignation. We should be angry about child abuse, for example. We should be angry about some things that happen, the wrongs, and we should hunger and thirst for justice. But wrath is disproportionate anger, anger that is over the top, if you like, and that's a deadly sin. So we asked, there was a survey where the British public, about 2000, were surveyed to rank the deadly sins in descending order of badness. And here's what they answered. Greed. Oh my goodness me, that attracted, that's a really, really bad thing. Um, in other words, worldly gain, wrath, disproportionate anger, sloth, envy, gluttony, lust, pride. What is funny about this is that it feels like the British public are answering the question, here's the sins I'm not okay with, greed, wrath, and I'm not too fussed about the other sins. Yeah, it's a trick question, really, because they're all soul killers, they're all deadly sins. But if I had to rank which one really is the kind of the beginning of all sin, really. The pride is pride, the pride of our first parents who wanted to be like God. They wanted to be the center. Um, they did not acknowledge their creatureliness. They wanted to be like God. And that kind of that's pride, and that's the beginning of unfortunately a legacy that we still live with. So what is sin? Disobeying right conscience, that sensitivity to God's law within. Breaking God's commandments, the law given by God through Moses. It's saying no to love. The greatest commandment is to love God above all and your neighbor as yourself. It is an offense against God, the God who is love. Um, and as I said, I've just mentioned the fall. We do share a fallen nature. We don't commit original sin. We contract it, because our nature is fallen in our first the real sin of our first parents. Not a myth. It's a real primordial turning away from God. We That effect leaves us with something that I've called concupiscence. We find it more difficult to love God and hate evil as we should. We find a tendency to choose our selfish way instead of God's. We experience a conflict between reason and desires, and every human being has this, where and whatever your moral complexion is, different things attract us, and what tempts one person may not tempt another. What would you say the age of reason was? Pause. When does a child begin to stop, as it were, making mistakes, stop being a little toddler, but actually start to be a reasoning being and the beginnings of a moral life and the need to kind of nurture that and help that child grow in virtue? Um, when does that begin? Well, obviously it's different for different persons. I think the Catholic Church says seven as a kind of age. It's kind of a marker. I mean, I shoplifted when I was five. My brother and I, who was four, we went down to what we call the bottom shop because it was the bottom of the street, and I stole Wrigley's spearmint gum. He tried to steal a chocolate bar. He got caught, started crying, and then the shopkeeper said to me, "Have you taken anything?" And I had these big blue eyes as a little kid, on it, super honest, when I was a super devious little. And I said, "No, no." And then I sort of stuffed my face with Wrigley's stomach and walked back up the street whilst my brother was crying. And my mother came down she was walking down the street to visit a neighbor, I think. And she said, "What are you eating?" And I said, "Bread." And I've never got anything by my mother, God rest her soul, but she bought it. She, okay. Um, so I was five, but I knew that was wrong. It's not cute. It's wrong. It was a bad thing. And notice how sin loves sinful company. So I steal and then I tell two lies. And that's the thing, you know, just as the commandments hang together, sin tries to create its own kind of community. So the age of reason is variable for variable, but it's important that we recognize that children are moral beings, and that they are growing into moral selves. They don't just become moral at 18. It's a journey for all of us, and it's a journey that doesn't stop. As I say, conscience is a lifelong formation task. All right then. So Sin is disobeying right conscience, as I say, breaking the commandments, failing to love God and neighbor. It is an offense against God. Our human nature, although created good, is fallen. We experience in ourselves a conflict between choosing the good we know we should and being attracted to the evil we should avoid. Um, but here's the good news. God sent his son to undo the power of sin and the sway of death. Death does not have the last word. Even in the Genesis creation account of the fall, there's a part of that which is called the proto-evangelium, the first announcement of the gospel, that one would come who would undo the power of sin and not just restore us, but raise us up to become sons and daughters of God by adoption through baptism. The mercy of God is the most beautiful mystery. I mean, God's mercy is unbounded. I once was teaching a year. Uh, she was a 14-year-old. Rachel, her name was. She was a super devout, lovely person, and we were talking about forgiveness. And I said, there's no sin which, if repented, can't be forgiven. And she says, well, even Hitler. And it was a hard thing to say, but there's no sin that is greater than the mercy of God. So it's kind of scandalous, really, in a good, that we want to we can trap ourselves in our own guilt. We can judge others, but really the mercy of God, revealed in Christ Jesus, is greater than any sin. And as Pope Francis says, God never gets tired of forgiving. So we get tired of asking for mercy and getting up off the ground. And so, although we've just talked about sin, sin does not have the last word. And God sent his son to undo the power of sin and the sway of death. Right. Now, one thing about the age of reason and recognizing, the moral character of young people is to train them in virtue, which is kind of like mindful habits, and to kind of help them avoid vices, which are often mindless and slovenly and whatever. So it's a very important part of morality. Morality is not just about doing the right thing. It's developing a character in which it's easier for you to conform to the moral law, and that's why conscience needs to be trained. And that's a lifelong task. So it's a bit like playing tennis. I'm rubbish at tennis, but if I want to be good at tennis, I need to work at it. I need to start being bad and then start getting better and getting that hand-eye coordination to make reliable ground strokes. And human virtues are things that we need to work at. We don't kind of just say, you know, they're not natural, they're second nature. So you might say, oh, well, I know someone and she's a people person. If it's a natural gift, fine. But still, you know, all true human virtues are we need to work at, you know. So it's to ingrain stable character traits, a combination of the reason and will. So virtues are second nature and not first nature. All right. So what virtues are? Well, there's plenty of them, but they're the four central ones in Catholic tradition, and actually not just in Catholic tradition, in antiquity. Four human virtues were recognized as what hinge virtues or cardinal virtues. Prudence, which is practical judgment, the ability to make judgment calls in real time, which are good, and to weigh the situation becoming for its moral contours before you. Justice, which means giving each their due. Fortitude. There's two kinds of courage. There's a courage of the moment, but there's a courage that's kind of more long term as well. Maybe the courage to just get up again off the ground when you're fighting some kind of character weakness. So fortitude covers both of those. And temperance is the happy enjoyment of pleasures. It's not being a cold fish and not, enjoy a good meal, but it's obviously not spilling into gluttony. And in Aristotle's kind of scheme of the virtues, virtues were like means, middle ways between two ways of going wrong. So, courage, like for example, when in 2005 I was mugged, attempted muggery in Portland, Oregon, and it was midnight. I was just coming back from, and two guys asked me the time, and then began to threaten with a knife. And they asked me for I had $20 and a mobile phone, a cheap brick of a phone. But I was, and I turned my back and said, no, I'm not. And I thought, well, here we go. And then they repeated the request with, let's say, some bad language attached to it. Um, and although it sounds like a bad movie, I said to them, leave me. I'm a big guy. I really did say that. And I'm going to call. So, and they ran off. So, was that courage? No. A bit of it was courage, but it was rashness, really. It was a bit rash because I was really angry. I mean, it just kind of got my. I've always had a real hatred of bullying and people forcing their will on others, and so I was really bristling with anger as well as yeah, I felt afraid. It was not a pleasant experience. But to the extent, courage can be rash. Courage is a midpoint between rashness and cowardice. So, to have courage, you need to have fear. That needs to be overcome. And it needs to be an important situation where the goal of your behavior is worth the exercise of courage. And that is decided by prudence, your prudential weighing of the situation. So cardinal pertains to hinge. Many other virtues hang on these, and we can name lots of them, patience, gratitude, etc. But there are virtues that we call supernatural or theological virtues. These are faith, hope, and charity. These are not, you can't earn your way, just like the human virtues. You can get better at being courageous by courageous acts. These are gifts from God, implanted in the soul at baptism, and they are to be fanned into flame. Faith, hope, and charity. And the greatest is love or charity. So, in Catholic understanding, there are three virtues planted at baptism directly in the soul by God. These are faith, hope, and charity. They are called theological or supernatural virtues. Once received, they must be built up with God's continuing help. The English question, what did St. Paul mean when he said the greatest of these is love? He didn't mean it in the three meanings that I've given you. He meant it in the fourth meaning, agape in Greek, caritas in Latin, charity or love in English. And that love is to purely desire the good of the other. And that's when we say God is love, that's what we mean. God is uncreated love. God's way is love. Um, and God's gift to us in baptism is that kind of love, by which we can will the good of another, even if we don't like them, even if it's a burden to us. And of course, that is the love with which Christ gave his everything for our salvation. It's a pure gift of self in the horror of crucifixion. It was to make possible our redemption. And that is what we mean by agape. And so when St. Paul says there are three things endure faith, hope, and charity, he means agape. This is the greatest. And this is what we're called to practice and cultivate. And it's a good question if you're teaching, for example, to ask your pupils, your students, what's the difference between love and like? Because agape is like a four-wheel drive vehicle. It'll go where like won't go. It'll go off-road, it'll go beyond. Whereas the other loves are kind of have an element of self-seeking if you're not careful. Agape doesn't. It is oriented towards the good of the other. So you can see Greek is a bit more helpful in kind of distinguishing what love means in the context that we use it here. So the moral virtues are acquired by human effort. They are the fruit and seed of morally good acts. The cardinal or hinge virtues are prudence, practical judgment, justice, fortitude, and temperance. The theological or supernatural virtues are directly infused by God. These are faith, hope, and charity, and the greatest of these is charity or caritas or agape. All right. Some of you might remember the time when after the resurrection, where in John's Gospel, where Jesus takes Simon Peter aside, Simon Peter, who will have in his memory that he denied Jesus 3 times during his passion. Um, and Jesus asks him, "Do you love me?" And it's funny when you read that in the Greek, because the first two times that Jesus asks, he says, "Do you agape me?" And Peter, because he's kind of perhaps ashamed, I don't know, he says, "You know that I friendship you, philia you." He doesn't use, and he's kind of it's kind of interesting to see the interplay of the two words agape and philia. Anyway, that's for theological geeks who like Greek. So, what about the Decalogue? That's a linchpin of Catholic moral teaching. In fact, the Decalogue binds every human being on the planet, not just Catholics, not just Christians. It binds all people because it's a law inscribed in our very being. Um, so, uh, for example, nobody celebrates theft, or a corrupt society will celebrate that. It's inscribed into our very being. And at Exodus, where the commandments are given by God to Moses, to the people, God is, as it were, revealing the commandments and ratifying what is already inscribed into the very being. So the Decalogue. Can you name the Ten Commandments? Well, pause if you want to give yourself a little test. Um, but here we go. And again, a little survey. Most Britons think only six of the Ten Commandments are still important principles to live by. Obviously, this is kind of frightening. Five, a small percentage thought, it's not important that you don't murder people. That's kind of, or don't know. It's anyway, but 93% were on board with that being a very important one. On stealing, lying, bearing false witness, being faithful to your spouse, and respecting your parents, and not being covetous. But as soon as we get to the bits we might say towards God, idolatry, cursing, and so on, people say, "Oh, well, no." And again, it's a bit like it's reflecting this kind of movement or attempted movement away from God. But there's a division in the commandments. The first three: put God first, love God above all, don't misuse his name, keep the Sabbath holy. They're directed, as it were, towards God. Then the other seven are directed towards neighbor, to love God in our neighbor. So honoring parents, not murdering, and don't commit adultery, and don't steal, don't lie, don't covet, etc. So in summary, the Ten Commandments could be summarized as love God above all things and love your neighbor as yourself. All right, so this is the Catholic catechetical listing. The Reformed tradition will list them in a different way. Um, so I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Then we move to honoring. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or more generally, the spouse. You shall not covet your neighbor's goods. Covet is to want jealously. So you can see that that's the Catholic listing, and it remains permanently valid for all peoples and all times. They're an outward reminder of what God has engraved in the human heart as the natural law. Now then, it's time for a little bit of a game. Do you know the commandments? In other words, I don't just mean that list, but I mean, do you know the sorts of behaviors covered by the commandments? So suppose I say, the fifth commandment, you shall not murder. But if I am violent towards someone, but I say, well, at least I didn't murder them, is that keeping that commandment? No, of course. That commandment is like the tip of the iceberg, but it covers a whole domain of behaviors. Bearing false witness, that covers our whole withholding the truth that a person has a right to know, etc. All of those things, sort of social media, they're all falls under do not bear false witness. So let's see if you can guess which behavior falls under which commandment. It's a kind of surprising, but you'll find that the Catechism has a really detailed treatment about this. So Let's pick a number. So let's say if I pick two, voting. That's funny. Which commandment encourages voting? You might think, surely there's not a commandment that, there is a commandment that encourages voting. And it is the fourth commandment. Um, More generally, it's about honor your father and mother, but it's about, honoring what as it were, your land, having a just, not a kind of jingoistic love of your land, but a just attachment to the flourishing, and therefore to contribute to its healthy political life, and paying taxes and stuff like that. So it's a kind of unusual one. You think, nah, that wouldn't be right, but it is. It falls under the fourth commandment. Um, Tax paying legitimate tax is certainly there as well. Let's go to number nine, kidnapping. Right, kidnapping. What would you say that was? So you take someone, threaten violence unless you get what you want. That falls under the fifth commandment. You shall not murder. Why? Because you're threatening violence, to someone, and keeping them in captivity. Let's go to number one. Sunday Mass, the obligation for Catholics, to attend Sunday Mass and to receive communion once a year, at Easter, at least once a year, and to obviously to be confessed sins before that, so that one receives in a state of grace. Um, that falls under the third commandment about keeping holy the Sabbath. So the Christian Sabbath is the eighth day. On the seventh day, God rested, but eighth day, as it were, day of resurrection, recreation. What about the first? No, let's go to four. Dressing modestly. Now, I'm not talking about, Victorian and ankles and stuff. I'm talking about just dressing modestly, for both men and women. It's not a that falls under the ninth commandment about not coveting your neighbor's spouse. What about eight? Fake news. Well, that falls under the eighth commandment about bearing false witness. What about three? Blasphemy. Well, I think that's probably clear to most of you. It's the second commandment that, about, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Let's go to number seven. Now, this is the trickiest one, simony. Now, simony is the marketing of spiritual gifts. It's actually trying to market and sell what is given freely by God. It owes its name to a character called Simon Magus. And Simon Magus wanted to buy the miracle power off Simon Peter. He wanted to say, "I'll pay you a sum if I can, use these." And again, that's similar. It's trying to market that which is a gift of God. It's a direct affront to God, um, and the worship of God. Number five, slavery. That's funny. You might think, well, isn't that the same as kidnapping? No, it's covered by a different commandment. And that one is, you shall not steal. You shall not steal. So with slavery, you're stealing someone's life and labor. And finally, number six, envy is covered by the 10th commandment. You shall not covet your neighbor's goods. And the one we haven't done on this nine grid is the 10th one is adultery. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not be unfaithful to your spouse. So I did this little task really to say that, if you're teaching this, you're not just teaching 10 separate behaviors. You're teaching a holistic set of behaviors, and they cover different domains, and they have much far-reaching consequences than is initially suspected. Okay, then, what about, let's kind of, we're rounding off this session now. Let's talk about vices and virtues. Now, I think, when I teach about this in my lectures, I always start with the vice. And why I start with the vice is not because I want to be negative. It's because you can create the opposite virtue. And it used to be on, in cathedral kind of displays. They used to show um, the vice virtue pairs, and so it's a kind of a traditional way of approaching um, vice and virtue. So again, I'm relying on a British survey which says, what are our bad habits? And we asked, there's two sorts of questions. What habits most annoy you in yourself? And B, what habits in others most annoy you? So, so this is a poll about 6, 7 years ago, and 2,000 British adults. Our bad habits: vaping, number 50. I'm not going to include all 50, but 49, fibbing, gossip, gaming. I've never been a gamer. I thank the Lord that I've never been into that because I can see, a large part of your life would be taken up with it. So Tetris is about as far as I got. Um, Cracking knuckles. I cannot crack my knuckles, thankfully, but I was teaching about vice and virtues in a group, and they began. I said, it really, I don't know. I can't. It's a hard thing to hear. Then they start cracking their knuckles at you, which is anyway. What can you do? Chewing your pen. If you're a pen chewer, hoarding. Are you a hoarder? Do you never throw stuff away and you pack up your rooms and spaces with stuff that you don't need? Too much TV. I suppose in my earlier days I probably watched too much TV. I used to be addicted to programs where they fix cars. I know that sounds really stupid, but I couldn't get enough of them. These where they get a car and an old classic and then fix it up, and it was just I spent too much of my time watching this kind of TV. But I don't have a television now. I haven't had one for about 10, 15 years, and so that's one I'm kind of I'd steer away from. Being untidy, unfortunately, is a vice that I have. I only have to look at something and it becomes untidy. Um, Number 16, are you a crispaholic? Well, you can tell me that. Um, are you a chocoholic? I'm not. I can buy a piece. I buy if I buy chocolate, it'd be dark chocolate, 60, 70, 80%. And I'll have a small piece, and it'll take a week or 2 weeks for me to get through it. But some people, I mean, some of my students admit they're completely chocoholics. Are you a social media addict? And again, some of my students say, yeah, they go to sleep watching TikTok videos, and it's like what? But we all have to kind of regulate our screen time, including myself. I suspect most of us really. Um, Too much fast food. Are you a pizzaaholic? Putting things off. Are you a procrastinator? I am to some extent. You'd be delighted to know I thought I need to do this CREDL video on morality, and I didn't put it up. So you're the beneficiaries of this. Are you a couch potato? Um, are you a nail biter? What comes in at number one? Well, the great British public said comfort eating. So that was the biggest bad habit when they looked into themselves. What about other people's bad habits? Okay. Leaving an empty milk carton in the fridge. So I guess that ticks off people. Not letting drivers out. Not holding the door for someone. I thought that was a bit, it's kind of some people might not welcome that. It's a tricky one. You've got to judge it, by ear, really. This is one that quite a lot of my students think, yeah, using a mobile on the checkout, quite a lot of them do work in retail, and this is a real big no-no. Putting bags on a spare seat. Yes, that's a naughty one, and it pretty much happens on every train journey or subway journey that someone nonchalantly just maybe scrolling, and there's a seat and people are standing. Misusing family parking. Noise from headphones. Yeah, I don't like that. That does tick me off. Queue jumping, absolute no-no. You do not jump the queue. Not giving up seats to a person who may need that seat more. And finally, misusing disabled spaces. That's really hacks people off. Okay, so why am I focusing on vices? Well, the thing is, especially if this is in a teaching context, you can ask the question, well, all right, what is the vice that someone is indulging when they knowingly put a, a bag on a seat that could be used by another? Well, we'd say that's inconsiderate. So, well, what's the virtue? Consideration. So you can create your vice virtue pairs very easily out of the vice that's identified, and then say, well, what's the opposite? So greedy, temperate, inconsiderate, considerate, undisciplined, disciplined, devious, honest, thoughtless, thoughtful, selfish, selfless, lazy, industrious, neglectful, painstaking, ignorant, conscientious, unhealthy, healthy, cruel, kind, careless, careful. That's just a little list, but it's kind of a good way because, when you look at bad habits, people always kind of like to talk about that, and they say, well, what is the vice? Um, when someone doesn't exercise, well, sloth. So what's the other one? Yeah, so it's kind of the way I choose to kind of approach these questions of vice and virtue. And the thing I try to leave with students is that vice is often mindless habit, but virtues are mindful habits. They're willed, practiced, um, ingrained character traits. And you can ask if you're in a teaching context to make a list of vices and to write the opposite virtue, possibly with some little display like I've just shown you. Um, what is the greatest virtue, and can pupils develop it by ourselves? Can we? And that's again targets the fact that there are some things called human virtues, and then some that are supernatural, and they are God's gift to us. And finally, a great question to ask is what's the difference between love, as Christians mean it, and like? And that's really good for especially a younger pupil's moral formation because it's everyone finds it easy to be nice to people that we like. Okay, hopefully you've learned something, and I will put up the other video, and hopefully this will send me any questions that you might have, and eventually I'll try and get back to them. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording.